for 18 consecutive years. This year, we proudly celebrate 50 years of history, 5 decades driven by a clear mission to contribute to the sustainable and inclusive prosperity of society by inspiring individuals and organizations through education and the generation of knowledge. Well, the global seminars are an initiative by FDC that brings together lectures, panels, and workshops organized in partnership with FDC's international partner schools and universities, with a clear purpose to promote meaningful exchanges of knowledge, ideas, and experiences and perspectives among students and professionals from institutions and organizations worldwide. We aim at these sessions at fostering constructive dialogue and a broader, more interconnected perspectives on the major global challenges of our times. Today, we are proud to co-host this seminar with the University of Galway in Ireland, a valued academic partner of FDC. Our institutions share a concrete commitment to international education, including that's been on for the last 2 years.
I think there's a glitch again.
It is a true honor to strengthen this partnership through conversations like the one we are about to have today. The world as we knew it is changing and changing fast, and trust me, I don't even like to use this sentence anymore because, well, we all feel and see it every day. The familiar global order is giving way to a more complex, multipolar reality, and international businesses are navigating this shift in real time, all the time, every day. So today we'll move from the macro picture, emerging powers and historical cycles, down to the very practical, techno-nationalism, talent mobility, and the tension between global cooperation and conflict. Our first speaker is Professor Paulo Vicente from FDC. He holds a PhD from FGV and brings a rare combination of experience across the private sector, government, and academia. He has advised global corporations such as Shell, Petrobras, and the US Department of Commerce. His expertise sits at the intersection of business strategy, public policy, and negotiation, making him the ideal voice to open today's conversation. So, Professor Paulo, the floor is yours for now.
Okay, thank you. First of all, good morning or good evening or good night for everybody. It's a pleasure being here. I'll be speaking for more or less half an hour. Let me put my slide share here. Despite everybody being surprised by what's going on, basically what's happening right now in the world is more or less within my model of scenarios. So let me explain a little bit and then show what's going on and what I think that will go on from the future. The general cycles model that I developed in the last 15 years is basically a combination of two cycles: the hegemonic cycles, or the global system of exchange in the last 500 or so years, and the Kondratiev cycles, or technological cycles, or key waves. Those are two historiographies that have been developed by other professors, other historians, other than me. What I did was combining those and making one simple hypothesis. What if those cycles continue? Can I extrapolate that? What is revealed about the future if I assume that it's reasonable to extrapolate those cycles into the future? I did that hypothesis in 2010, and what appeared is this history, or future history if you prefer, or time frame if you prefer. To understand it and to explain it, I created a narrative that is called a century in 4 acts, 4 major events in the century. We are right now close to the end of the first act, the general crisis of the 2020s. When I explained that by the early 2010s, it was not very well received because people said, well, we are going into the crisis in the next decade. Everything's going so fine. But, well, you know, in 2020, we had the pandemics. In 2022, we had the new war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. And in 2023, we had a comeback of the war in the Middle East. In 2025, the tariff wars from the United States. And now we have a major crisis in Iran, a new oil shock. The model was correct. The model correctly predicted that several geopolitical crises would occur within this decade. And as a reaction to that, we would have lots of investment in technology. So basically, the fifth cycle of technology is ending, and we are preparing for the next one, the sixth cycle of technology. So we are right now exactly within this process. And I'm going to explain a little bit more over this half an hour. But the model also predicts that by 2030, this will be over. And we'll be again into a recovery phase, but still with the United States as a hegemonic power. This will reach an apex in the act number 2 in the 2040s, the technological revolution of the 2040s, based probably on the technologies that are on the rise now. This will create several imbalances, but also a very strong expansion of the worldwide economy. This will lead to an exhaustion and a new crisis, this second crisis by the 2060s, together with the transition war between the United States and a new hegemonic power. From 100 to 140 years, with an average and median of 120 years, the global system of exchange enters the transition phase from one major hegemonic power to another. So this period will be analog to the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, and the World Wars, the first two wars combined into a single event. Of course, the fourth act is the rise of a new hegemonic power. This is my model based on an extrapolation of those two historiography cycles. Of course, just by looking at this, several questions appear. That's science. Whenever you answer one question, what happens if those cycles continue? We have several new questions. I have partial answers to those questions because we don't have the data from the future. So what we can do is creating basically scenarios. Today, I'm going to explore the first act because it's the current crisis, but a little bit of the second act, the technological expansion, and depending on the questions, I can explain a little bit on the third and fourth acts. But my focus right now is the first and second one. So what we are seeing now, a new Cold War. I like to start with this image from The Economist, the Russian bear and the lap of the Chinese panda. Those two nations have aligned themselves to create a new world order. And this has created a new Cold War. After 30 years, we have now a Cold War again. Was that predictable? The answer is yes, using Kondratiev cycles, which is one of my two models. Nikolai Kondratiev was a Russian. He perceived that technology didn't evolve linearly, but rather in cycles, in leaps and bounds. Every 50 to 60 years, there was a technological revolution. And it occurred around 20 to 30 years after a major crisis. So you're seeing here that those 5 cycles always ended in a major crisis, including wars between Europe and Russia. The end of the first cycle was the Napoleonic Wars, culminating in an invasion of Napoleon in 1812. The second one in a series of wars, American Civil War, the formation of Italy and Germany, the Taiping Rebellion in China, the Meiji Restoration in Japan, and also the Crimea War. The end of the third is the First World War, and in case of Russia, it's Civil War afterwards. And the fourth cycle had the apex of the first Cold War, including Arab-Israeli wars and the oil shocks. It was relatively easy to predict that by 2020s we would have new wars. Actually, I predicted 3 potential wars. 2 of those are right now occurring. Wars in the Middle East, wars in the Eastern Europe, and wars in Southern Asia. 2 out of those 3 are confirmed. The third one is not here. But as you can see, the model can predict what's happening now. No model can predict everything. No model can explain everything. But the Kondratiev cycles are particularly good to explain what's happening now. And according to them, by 2030, things will become easier, better, and there will be a new recovery phase and reaching for a new technological revolution by 2040. You can see that our period, the fifth Kondratiev cycle, we have now the recovery phase in the 80s, then a very strong expansion phase in the 90s, the exuberant 90s, the exhaustion became around 2005, just afterwards the 9/11 crisis, and we are now in the crisis phase. So this is the Kondratiev cycles. I normally use together with it other models to complement the understanding. What we are seeing in the end, an analog to the 60s and 70s. We are now again in a Cold War, but not against Soviet Union, but rather with Russia and China. We have a new space race, but now it's no longer the Apollo program, but rather the Artemis program. And Artemis will send its second mission next week, April 1st. So we are probably seeing Artemis gaining momentum in the next few years. Middle East wars, actually those wars are right now peaking. They are bringing also oil price volatility and increasing terrorism. But not everything is equal. There are differences between those two periods. We don't have a war in Vietnam, and we didn't have a refugee crisis in Europe. So it's not equal. It's an analog. A looks like B, but there are differences. But you can see that it helps us understanding our time based on our previous time. And this facilitates creating a new zone of comfort in our mind. I have listed 17 potential crises for this time, for our decade, in 2012. Among them, a pandemic and wars. But when I filtered them by probability, impact, and time frame, the pandemic and the wars were stopped by the probability. The probability was either low or could not be calculated. So they were potential. In our case, they were confirmed. Not all the wars, 2 out of the 3 that I predicted. Of the other 15, 5 passed to all 3 filters. They had high probability, high impact, and the time frame was correct. Crisis in the pension systems all around the world and reduction of the glaciers, implying lack of water and therefore lack of food, created inflationary pressure. And we had inflation in the United States peaking by 2022. The peak was biggest inflation in 50 years. 50 years is not by coincidence a Kondratiev cycle. So again, the Kondratiev cycles explain very well what's happening now. And we are now into what we call stagflation with an oil shock. This is absolutely an analog of the 70s. How did we left stagflation behind in the 80s? New technologies. What we are doing right now, developing new technologies. So most likely we will have stagflation for the rest of the 2020s, and we will become again growing by 2030s because of new technologies. The analog between the 60s, 70s, and 80s appear again. Third major crisis, change in energy matrix requiring new investments. And right now, we are not even talking more about energy transition, but rather do energy addition. We are going to use all sources of energy, coal, oil, nuclear, everything. Why? We need not only more energy, particularly because of AI consumption, but also people want to be less reliable, less relying in Russia and the Middle East. And the reasons are wars, geopolitical instability. So everybody is now looking for all sources of energy. Inefficient and ineffective states make raise in taxes to compensate for that. So the whole world is creating more taxes, creating more debts, and printing more money. And it's also an effect caused by terrorism and cultural conflicts. Not only they raise in taxes, but also they reduce the privacy. There is a loss of privacy for the people. And people don't like that. So they say, you don't represent me. And we have institutional crisis, not only in the democracies, but also in the dictatorships. You can see crisis in Iran, in China, in Russia, but also in the democracies, United States, France, even Brazil, India. So it's general. It's not a crisis of the democracies, it's not a crisis of the dictatorships, it's all around the world. Those are the crises that I predicted by 2012. They were already in place by 2017. The question is, what's going on from now onwards? So here is my timeline up to 2042. Here we can see some economic crises of the jugular cycles every 7 years. 2015 and 2022 already confirmed, 29 and 36 still hypothetical. And you can see the apex of the crisis here between 2023 and 2026. But the crisis itself goes up to 2030. Afterwards, we'll have a recovery. What happened in the last few years, and which are the three main movements that I can see from now onwards? 2018 was a very critical year, the cross between exhaustion and crisis. China changed its constitution to allow Xi Jinping to be re-elected for a lifetime or eternally, creating a one-man rule and no longer a party rule. And also, the United States started the first trade war in the first mandate of Donald Trump. This marked the transition to the crisis phase. In 2019 and 20, we saw the Brexit effects. Brexit was voted in 2016, and now the effects was implemented in 19. Also, a series of protests all around the world, and this is the flag of Hong Kong, which is the worst case, but not the only case. 20 and 21, we have been hit by a pandemic, a global pandemic, COVID-19. Some people say it's a black swan, unpredictable. Others say it's a regular event that comes from time to time. Actually, COVID-19 was the sixth pandemic in the world in the last 40 years. We had HIV, Ebola, H1N1, MERS, SARS, and then COVID-19. And on average, they come every 6 to 7 years. So I prefer the logic that this is not an isolated case. We will have other pandemics in the future. In 22, we had the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, or the second phase of the invasion by Russia into Ukraine. In 23, the attack from Hamas into Israel, and the Middle East wars came back with very strong. In 25, we had trade war 2.0 from the second mandate of Donald Trump. And here we are in 26. What comes from now onward? Three movements. First movement, crisis. We are not over the apex of crisis, and we are not over the crisis itself. Until 2030, we are still seeing crisis. And whether we like or not, there will be other shocks. Some are predictable, some are not predictable. So basically, we have to be in safe mode in the next 4 to 5 years. But afterwards, we are going to see an increase in technological disruption. So the second movement is a series of technological disruptions. How can I know that? Follow the money. First, Artemis program, which is now scheduled to land on the moon into 2028. Actually, this date can be rescheduled, but the umbrella of investment, which is Artemis program, will be kept. So we are going to see billions of dollars entering technology, and this will create several technological disruptions and several externalities, and this will create the basis for a sixth Kondratiev cycle. Also, Europe decided to heavily invest in military technology. The Readiness 2020, actually, this was released in March last year, and basically is an investment of 800 billion euros, and some sources say extra 1 trillion euros in infrastructure. Europe is rearming. Europe has decided that after 11 years since the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, in 2025, they decided to rearm and get ready for a potential war with Russia in particular. And the Genesis mission. The Genesis mission is from the United States. They are integrating several artificial intelligence laboratories to create what they call the Manhattan Project of our time. They are going for several new technologies. They don't explain exactly what they are doing. My take, and this is a personal hunch, they are going to try to make fusion power, fusion nuclear reactions controllable in an economic way. So you can see there are several sources of information that lead us to believe that there will be several technological disruptions in the future. Third movement, new crisis. My date of reference is 2035, when China wants to have completed expansion of its nuclear arsenal to create a mutually assured destruction of the United States. They are developing their arsenal and new carriers to solve the problem of Taiwan until 2040. So what they are telling us, between 2035 and 2040, they intend to solve the problem of Taiwan. That means war. So we have around 9 to 14 years to see this war in Asia. Of course, this may not happen. Of course, this may happen earlier. We don't know. But this is an event that has strong funding and strong political support to happen between this time frame, to 2035 and 2040. So we cannot ignore this possibility. We cannot ignore this scenario. Second one is a new pandemic. It's not if, it's when and how strong it will be. Eventually, there will be one, another one, and another one. Pandemics will come from time to time. Last but not least, an Iran with nuclear weapons. Right now, the war in Iran is just to avoid this black swan in the future. Will the United States be able to avoid this black swan in the future or not? We don't know for sure. If they can't avoid that, Iran will probably keep on pursuing the nuclear program. Saudi Arabia already alerted that if Iran develops a nuclear weapon, they will also develop. So the risk of a nuclear war in the Middle East grows over time. We don't know exactly when those black swans will happen, but we have to be sure that there will be some of them at some point. What we do about that? We have to get ready. We have to get ready for crisis, and we have to get ready for opportunities. Several technological disruptions will be both opportunities and threats. And some of those crises will also be opportunities, depending on how you prepare for them. So this is my main view of the next 12, 14 years. Get ready. What are we seeing in the end? A game, what I call a multiplayer game, a multipolar game, and I make a metaphor with the Chaturajya, an Indian game of the four kings, or the four Raji. But who are those four Raji? For me, those are United States, European Union, India, and China are the four Raji, the four kings. But I see also three not as powerful, but relatively powerful. And so I call them the dukes or Raus in the Indian metaphor. Brazil, Japan, and Russia. They are not as powerful as the kings, but they are very powerful too. None of those 7 players can win this game alone. They need to make alliances. And those alliances are shifting right now. How? Who are the blocks of alliance? Well, we have here the main contenders, United States, or America first, according to Donald Trump, facing the dictatorships of Russia and China, more or less aligned. The democratic bloc was fragmented, and now we have a group of anti-China countries in Asia, Taiwan, Australia, Japan, and South Korea. They are allied with the United States by being anti-China. And there is another group, Europe and Canada, which are allied by being anti-Russia. Those three groups were together until Donald Trump came into power. Now they are less aligned, but still somewhat aligned by being anti-China and anti-Russia. Here you can see European Union, United Kingdom, Canada, and Ukraine. Also aligned with those, but not completely aligned, are the pro-United States and pro-Europe. Mexico, Argentina, Israel, Philippines, Turkey, and Indonesia. But also pro-dictatorships, you have there Iran, Belarus, Qatar, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. And trying to be neutral, Brazil, India, and Saudi Arabia. They are trying to maintain neutrality, which is very hard at this moment. European Unions try to get closer to the Mercosur and India, understanding that they need new alliances in this new world. Which is this new world? Basically, I like to make an analog with the second part of the British hegemony. The second part of the American hegemony is similar, an analog with the late 19th century and early 20th century. Just after the Napoleonic Wars, the United Kingdom was completely dominant. But by the 1870s, there were new powers. France had been recovered. France, Italy, and Germany have been unified. United States, after the Civil War, was rising. Japan, after the Meiji Restoration, was also rising. Russia was organizing. But there were decadent powers. The Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire were in decadence. What this led? This led to World War I, a new colonial race, and later a world war. This is my take. We are seeing that again. A new colonial race, and therefore there will be a new world war. When? Around 2060s. So which are the similarities and differences? You have a techno-military race again. You have a global resource scramble, race for natural resources. We have new strategic partnerships. The formation of military alliances are being redone. And we have a risk of global conflict in the future. There are differences. Population is not growing the same way that 19th century. Actually, it's stabilizing in most of the world. And the resource race scope is different. We are no longer limited to Earth. We are also going in this race for natural resources into the inner solar system, particularly Moon, Mars, and the asteroid belts. So this is an analog that allows us to understand what's happening in light of history. But history doesn't repeat itself, so things are not equal. So let's have a brief look at the technological revolution that complements that. What's happening really? We have two problems to solve. Lack of natural resources in an aging and reducing population. Population is becoming smaller and aging very fast. And we don't have enough natural resources to keep on growing. So how do we solve that? New sources of raw material, and we have automation and human enhancement, or human enhancement technologies, or HAT for short, if you prefer. This means energy addition and space resources, but also digital transformation in Industry 4.0. Those terms are probably familiar for everybody here. And we call regenerative medicine. We are no longer cure. We are going to regenerate the tissues of the human body, maintaining it as long as possible in youth, but not forever. Evidence, here you can see that 12 technologies that are receiving more money from the Department of War, former Department of Defense of the United States, in those three blocks. You can see the green technologies there, including space. You can see the automation, information warfare, artificial intelligence, robotics and sensors, and human enhancements. The idea of the green technology is to reduce the cost of energy and raw materials. The idea of automation is to reduce the need of people, of labor. And the idea of the human enhancement is to extend the life of people. Some people say 120 years of life expectancy, others say 150 years of life expectancy. You can see the investments here in the last few years. For 2027, this will probably jump because the United States is saying that it's going to grow 50% the budget of the military. So we can see probably 270, $280 billion of research and development next year. Also, you are seeing the Innovation and Competition Act to put another $250 billion in research and development. And for basically to sustain Shift and Science Act, $280 billion on subsidies. This is not research and development. There is a discussion inside the United States right now whether the best way to bring back manufacturing or reshore the industries are subsidies or tariffs. So both parties agree that they need to bring back manufacturing. They disagree in which method is better. Right now, we have both. We have subsidies and tariffs. This is the United States. If you look at Europe, this is what we know from the Readiness to 2030. We are going to put 800 billion euros in investment in defense in those areas: air and missile defense, artillery systems, ammunition and missiles, drones and counter-drones, mobility, which is basically infrastructure. Some sources say an extra 1 trillion euros just for mobility, AI, quantum, cyber, and electronic warfare, and some strategic enablers: strategic airlift, air-to-air refueling, maritime domain awareness, and space assets. Europe is rearming. Europe is a new player. Europe was more or less in sleep mode for 11 years. It's no longer there. It's becoming a major player in the world. And that's it. This is the covers of my new books, only in Portuguese, sorry. Let me stop my sharing here with 30 minutes, more or less. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Paulo. And as someone said in the chat, if I could advise you all here is to believe him. So trust me. So now I'll let Professor Diego from FDC introduce Professor Vanessa from Galway. Diego has facilitated this session and has a previous relationship with the University of Galway. So Diego.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mateus. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Professor Paulo, for your very insightful presentation. It's amazing to see how you can really get everything together, because it's impressive to see how many pieces we have moving around at the same time right now. And it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Vanessa to everybody. I had the pleasure to be at the University of Galway 3 years ago, I guess. My goodness, how time goes fast, right? And we worked together for a short period there. Professor Vanessa was with us last year as a visiting professor here at FDC. She is a management professor at the University of Galway and program director of the Masters in International Management. Her research in global strategy, international businesses, and entrepreneurship has been published in leading journals, including the Journal of World Business and the Journal of International Management. And she brings both rigorous academic depth and generally in a very international perspective. So it's a real pleasure to have you here with us again, Vanessa. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Diego. Thank you to all FGC team for the opportunity of co-organizing this global seminar. Thanks to Mateus, Leticia, and Paulo, also Paulo for the insightful presentation. Let me share my presentation now. Let me see if you can see it. Yeah, perfect. So, as Diego said, I'm an international business scholar, but my background is on international relations, political science. So I saw the current context as a perfect opportunity for bringing the two together and try to see whether some of the international relations theories and perspectives could help us to understand what is happening and also gives insights to businesses, especially internationally scaling businesses that I'm going to explain more later. So this work here that you can see, I'm going to talk a bit about that. I co-developed together with Professor Esther Chipman, also from University of Galway. And it is, as you can see, currently one of, I think, the most read paper that has been published at the Multinational Business Review Journal, which reflects the relevance and the importance, the interest in this type of topics. Because as Paulo well mentioned, we are kind of living very intense moments at the time, and probably these are parts of cycles. And then, of course, that we need to understand more to try to see how businesses can deal better with this type of situation, right? So basically, the impacts of geopolitical disruptions is not something on businesses, is not something new. There's a lot of papers, a lot of insights on the impacts of geopolitical tensions, especially to multinational firms. So this is something that is kind of well documented. But considering the context that we are now, and especially those type of companies that are leading the technological disruptions, that are on the front of the technological changes, that are firms that we call scaling businesses. These firms, they are different from mature multinational companies, and they have different impacts of geopolitical tensions over them. And also they can also become relevant political actors influencing somehow what we are observing, the geopolitical scenario. So in that work, we argue that the exposure and the risks of these internationally scaling businesses is different from what we know about mature multinational firms. So basically, we elaborate here on the impact of geopolitical tensions to scaling businesses, and also how these scaling businesses can become relevant political actors and kind of change the game, alter the game that we are seeing. Just to briefly contextualize, I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but just to flag what I mean here by scaling businesses and what are the main differences between mature traditional multinational firms and this type of internationally scaling businesses. So scaling businesses are concerned with developing their business to a competitive size by capturing market space very, very quickly through exponential growth. So scaling is a process of persistent exponential growth in outputs, leveraging associated with returns to scale. So they are different from new ventures, as they have a validated business model, they have product market fit, and they are also different from mature multinational firms because they still have somewhat limited resources. They are still in the process of becoming mature multinational firms, and they are doing that very quickly. They are really going through internal transformations and a lot of internal processes in a very quick way. The scaling often happens across borders to capitalize on market opportunities in different places, also to capitalize on resource-seeking opportunities. So that's why our focus here, considering geopolitical tensions, is scaling businesses that are operating across borders. And just briefly summarizing what we see as the key differences between these mature multinational firms and these scaling businesses. Mature multinationals, they very often they rely on well-established resources, legitimacy, and the organizational resilience due to their formal structure, organizational structure. When dealing with this type of geopolitical tensions, they tend to optimize their footprint to manage risks, so they have more conditions to deal with these risks from the external environment, such as geopolitical tensions. And they are also very powerful overall. They really have the ability to influence the behavior of governments, the behavior of political activities, of political actors. Scaling businesses, they often have innovative value proposition and business models that leverage digital resources and information. So they are at the forefront for technological disruptions. They often are the ones that bring these technological disruptions. They have control over data and dominance in cutting-edge technological innovations. And because they capture market space very quickly, they also are able to transform this market power that they achieve into political power. And because governments, they really don't understand exactly what they are doing, they don't understand necessarily the type of technologies or their business models, they often are bolder in their actions to influence the environment, to influence the geopolitical tensions, the geopolitical actions. So considering scaling businesses, we understand that the geopolitical tensions, they can impact in a more aggressive way this type of businesses, because the uncertainty of that geopolitical tensions create limit some of the conditions that scaling businesses they need in order to capture market space quickly. And these are mainly because of three factors. The first one is because they are still limited in some of the resources. They are still in the process of becoming a large firm, a large multinational company. And the risks that arise from the geopolitical tensions, they are very relevant, and they can create problems to these companies to become unviable to scale internationally. They often involve these frontier technologies that also increases the risks. And the uncertainty overall is well known that uncertainty also undermines confidence in entrepreneurial behavior. And we're going to see that entrepreneurial activities are essential when we are talking about internationally scaling businesses. These are important for them to maintain their dominance over industries that are changing very fast. Now, enough about scaling businesses. This was just like to introduce why they are relevant and why we decided to focus on this type of businesses. What we did was to also dialogue with international relations theory to understand how different worldviews and then the increasing geopolitical tensions coming from different sources, they can affect directly the enablers of international scaling, how these tensions can really affect the way that these companies grow. And for that, we dialogue with two main competing visions within international relations theory. The first one is the cooperation logic that is based on a liberalist view of international relations that focus on interstate cooperation. So according to this view, we have different actors that are relevant in the international arena, not only the governments, so firms, companies are also important actors, international institutions are also important actors. And the main goal of the actors within the international system is to achieve their mutual interests simultaneously and to find a way for economic interdependence. So the economic interdependence is the stabilizing force of the international arena, according to this view. We also dialogue with the conflict, the opposing view, the conflict view based on the realist theory of international relations that considers the international arena is mainly dominated by conflict. They all only consider as relevant actors the states, the governments. So firms, international institutions are not relevant actors according to this view. And the actors that are relevant to the states, they are seeking national security. They are seeking their own national interests, regardless of economic independence. So they prioritize security over economic interdependence. So they are very different in essence, but both of them, they agree that what we are living at the moment, the geopolitical tensions are very important threats to this greater global integration. So they consider different causes for this, and they predict different scenarios, but all of them, they have interesting insights that we can use to understand better how companies are dealing with that. This is our main model, the model that we propose. I'm just highlight a couple of points here. So, for example, according to the cooperation logic, this logic considers that the globalization trend is a result of a combination of failing international institutions, the changes in the perception of payoffs of cooperation by actors, by different countries. And this also, all these trends, they lead to movements that we are observing recently. So an increase in anti-globalization populism, increasing economic protectionism, and more actions towards interdependence de-risking. On the opposite view, in contrast, we have the realist scholars proposing that the main factor affecting what we are seeing today, creating these geopolitical tensions, is the decline of the US as a global hegemon. So these dialogues well with what Paulo presented before. So we are seeing now other players that are threatening the hegemon power of the US, like China and Russia. And this, the hegemony was the stabilizing force according to the conflict view. So this is the main source of instability. And this leads to movements such as increasing rivalry, techno-nationalism, more state interventionism, and more national security claims to kind of justify some actions that we are observing. All these movements that come from the cooperation or the conflict logic, they have an influence and they are affecting the main enablers of international scaling that are these four: business model replication across international markets, the ability to grow very quickly in international markets and to have returns to scale, human capital acquisition, and digitalization. So I'm going to now briefly talk about each one of these key enablers of scaling and bring some examples on how companies are being affected by them. So starting with the replication, right? So similar to what we see with multinational firms, internationally scaling firms, they also need to balance the tension between standardization and local adaptation. But the difference here is that for them to grow internationally very fast, they need to maximize standardization and minimize local adaptation. At the same time, that they need to continue engaging in entrepreneurial activities. So they must follow what we call a replicable innovation approach. They need to continue innovating, but in a way that they can replicate across markets to remain competitive in such dynamic markets, right? And all these movements that we saw, that I pointed out before, anti-globalization, populism, rising economic protectionism, these national security claims, they increase the demand for local adaptation. And as they do that, the ability of scaling companies to follow a replicable innovation approach is reduced. And this affects the potential for these companies to scale internationally. One good example of a company that had to deal with that during the scaling phase was TikTok. So TikTok has faced increasing demands for local adaptation from the US, from European Union, especially related to that data storage. So governments from the US and countries in European Union, they started to demand that TikTok had invested in data centers to store data locally. And this created additional costs for TikTok in a phase where they were trying to leverage returns of scale and access markets. And this was a big challenge for them in terms of really keeping the pace of their growth. So the examples of actions that they needed to take at the time were to create these two projects, Project Clover, Project Texas, that were initiatives to comply with the requirements from these governments for local adaptation in terms of data storage. Moving to the second enabler, rapid internationalization. For internationally scaling firms, it's very important that they can really have a fast pace of internationalization, so they can capture market space very quickly, and they can have first mover advantages, because we're talking about frontier technologies, disruptive business models, etc. But this type of movements that we saw before, that relates to the conflict and cooperation logic, like protectionist policies, these shifting interests in economic interdependence, limited market opportunities, etc. This creates challenges for these firms to access markets and to leverage network effects. That is very important for them to reach other markets very quickly. So we have two examples to illustrate how rapid internationalization can be affected by geopolitical tensions. One is the example of SenseTime, that is a facial recognition company. And the US imposed sanctions over SenseTime, claiming that they had involvement in the surveillance of a minority group, the Uyghurs, in China. And because of that, they banned all US investment in SenseTime. Because of this restriction, they experienced an initial delay in its IPO. So this created a lot of challenges for SenseTime in terms of accessing funding and securing funding that they needed at the time when they were scaling. Another example is WeChat. So WeChat, the US imposed restrictions over WeChat, claiming potential national security risks, and they banned all the US app stores to offer WeChat for the users in the US. And this clearly affected the potential to WeChat to reach out and to expand their reach into the US market, and affected their potential to explore network effects in that market. The third aspect, the third enabler of scaling, super important as well, human capital acquisition. So scaling firms, when they are entering their scaling phase, they start to grow very fast internally. It's a movement of internal transformation that requires organization building capabilities. So they need to hire new people. They need to create a lot of new jobs in order to sustain the growth momentum. They need to bring operational roles and also leadership position, people to assume leadership positions as well. And in the context that we are with these disruptive international geopolitical tensions, we are also observing a lot of anti-immigration movements and anti-immigration actions, especially, but not only in the US, countries that are very reliant on immigration because they lack people to assume some of the positions, such as European countries. We are also observing this type of movements in European countries. And one good example of a company that has been directly affected by these movements in terms of accessing the human resources they needed to scale is a German scale-up company called FD Tech. They are specialized in autonomous driving software. And because of these anti-immigration movements and sentiments in Germany at the time, they started to lose a lot of key employees, key workers that were there to help them during the scaling phase. And they found very difficult to replace these workers. So this is something that we probably can anticipate, or that may have been started to be a problem in the US as well with these new policies implemented by President Trump. And finally, the last enabler of international scaling, digitalization. Very important because when scaling firms, they leverage digital resources and capabilities, they can increase their output generation capacity very fast, and this enable rapid growth. So they can leverage digital scale-free resources to have an increase in output at the same time that they keep the marginal costs low. So digitalization is very important for scaling firms. And considering the geopolitical tensions that we are observing and restrictions on critical technologies related to techno-nationalist discourse, to national security claims, some of these companies, they are facing a lot of challenges to access the technology they need in order to take advantage of digitalization. So, for example, we have in some industries, very specific industries that are very strategic. These restrictions can create a lot of problems, as the US restrictions over semiconductor technology to use US technology in production process. These restrictions affected directly companies such as the One.ai, that is specialized in AI-driven solutions. And what they did was they tried to anticipate before the ban took place. They tried to buy a lot of chips from US company Nvidia prior to the ban to make sure that they would have the resources they needed to produce their solutions. So this is one example of how this type of claims can directly affect the ability to scale. And finally, I just want to shift a bit here the lens. So far what I have explained is more related to how the geopolitical environment, the geopolitical tensions can affect elements that are important for this type of businesses that are scaling. now I want to shift the lens to see how these firms, they can become very important political actors as well. Because they have rapid market expansion, they have advanced technological capabilities, they have disruptive business models, so they control resources and they have knowledge that governments, they don't quite understand. They are at the frontier. They can become very powerful agents. So they can assume two different types of roles. They can become agents actively influencing the geopolitical environment, but they can also be used by governments as instruments to achieve their national objectives, their foreign policy objectives. So they can also be instruments of the states. There are different ways that they can be either agents or instruments. So similar to multinational firms, they can also engage in corporate political activity, for example, such as the case of Shine. Shine is a Chinese firm. And when they are in the fashion industry, fashion retailer, in digital business. And when they were scaling, when they were in the scaling phase, they decided to hire a U.S. official, a former U.S. official, to help them with their lobbying efforts into the European Union region, preparing for their IPO. So they did that strategically to help them to deal with local regulations, etc., in actively engaging in lobbying. Another way of doing that is through what we call paternalistic power. So when these firms, they assume the roles or some functions that governments traditionally have, such as providing public goods. So they take over these functions from governments and they provide public goods in order to have more influence over political activities. So one example is the company Stripe. Stripe is a financial services and software businesses with dual headquarters in Ireland and the US. And they have a project called Progress Ireland Program. So this program that was launched by the founders of Stripe is to provide services and to develop local infrastructure, like some institutional voids that exist here in Ireland, that they were trying to solve on behalf of the government. And of course, that they have advantages by doing that, having some influence over political activities and decisions in the country. And finally, as I also mentioned before, because these firms, they are very disruptive in their business models, they really can leverage their market power in that way. They can be more aggressive than mature multinationals in their political interventions. For example, Uber, in one occasion, decided to encourage its drivers in France, in Paris, to protest against the government, directly against a government decision. So they incentivize civil disobedience to achieve a decision that was of their interest at the time. So this is one example of an aggressive and active intervention. And on the other side, when we talk about scaling as instruments, they can either be a source of economic statecraft when the states really want to use these companies to achieve their foreign policy objectives, such as the example of the US providing venture capital to help domestic companies to overcome scaling challenges. So you can see here, this is InQtel, is a US government backed investor. They are focused on military and intelligence technologies. So they provide funding to domestic companies in that in those industries so they can scale faster. They also can be used, the scaling firms can also be used as a source of soft power. So soft power in terms of influencing the behavior of other countries in an indirect way, using intangible sources of power, such as culture, etc. So one good example in the case of US as well is how they use and leverage the Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley has a lot of successful scaling firms in there. So it's kind of a branch that they use to show or to diffuse the values of liberal capitalism or how the US is successful, etc. And we are observing that China started also to use its technology firms to try to counterbalance this effect of the US. And finally, I think that probably I'm over time already, but just to end the session, because our idea when we elaborated on these arguments and we try to use the international relations theory to help us to see how these firms can be affected and affect the geopolitical environment was to propose some reflections and also to create a research agenda or a way that people could maybe explore some of the topics that we identified here and that they are going to be very relevant in the future, especially considering the scenario that Paulo presented to us before. So some of the ideas, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I want to have time for us to discuss as well, but is to have some more comparative studies, understanding the differences on how mature multinational firms and international scaling firms, they can be affected by all these forces, to understand the role of the home country as an influence for or as a potential drawback in their international scaling efforts, to understand how they can be used as instruments of state power, also how they can be used as sources of soft power, and also not be restricted to these two main theories of international relations that I presented here, but to also incorporate more critical views that can be relevant to the debate. And yeah, you have here a couple of examples of questions that we think that can be relevant to be explored in the future. But I think I'm going to end here so we can have more time to discuss.
Thank you, Vanessa. We can share the presentation with all of our attendees.
Very, very interesting. Thank you, Vanessa. It's amazing to see how complementary both presentations are, because Paulo Vicente gave us a kind of huge scenario of what's going on and what might happen in the near future. And you discussed how these very complicated international outsets that is playing out right now affect scaling businesses. And well, I took notes of several things here that I'd like to understand in a deeper sense. But before, I'd like to open the floor to whoever has questions, because probably you guys want to ask questions to understand better or have more details about what was said by both Vanessa and Professor Paulo. So please, you can type your question into the chat box, or you can just open your mic and ask it. So feel free to do it right now.
Hello, Diego.
Hello, Rafael. How are you doing?
I'm very good. Thank you. And congratulations for you guys from FDC, Paulo and Vanessa, for the presentations. Thank you, guys. My question would be something in between, let's say, between macroeconomy and business individually. I have two screens, so I have some here, some preparation, and I type my notes over here. The US just this week on the 33rd of March the treasurer declare insolvency. So in another term, they don't have money to pay out their debt. And I almost don't see that on the news. And I would like to hear from Paulo and Vanessa, what are the consequences that we have these over the US, of course, and here in Brazil or around the world, if they can share some thoughts about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. Paulo, maybe you want to start it?
Okay, this is part of what is expected in a period of a new Cold War race and war race. They're spending more, not only United States, but Europe and China. And this is stretching United States finances, right? And they intend to increasing 50% the expenditures of the Department of War for next year. The United States is seeing the treasuries being sold out, and you're seeing the gold being the new reserve internationally. And the United States will see more and more pressure and limitations in doing what they are willing to do, which is expending more money, particularly in the military. And they will be limited. The market will limit, particularly if you look at the United States 10-year treasury, and if you look at gold, and also if you look at the budget of them. They cannot sustain what they want. And that's a clear sign of an hegemonic power that no longer can hold its hegemonic. That means over time, the United States will be less and less hegemonic, and other powers will rise. This is the late 19th century all over again. Britain no longer being able to maintain its hegemony, and you see the rise of France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United States back then, and they will see a more and more geopolitical, multipolar geopolitics, in which the alliances will shift from time to time. More specifically, in your case, we're seeing the United States treasury being dumped by several countries, not only China. Actually, Japan is the biggest holder of the United States treasury right now. They are dumping it and buying gold. So follow the money, buy gold.
Yeah, just complementing what Paulo said, I think in terms of businesses, what we are started to observe is that because this change on prioritization on the investments to defense, etc., clearly affects the type of industries that are kind of on the edge, or in some of the industries for sure are going to struggle more because they are not directly relevant to the objectives at the moment of these states. And you have effects also in terms of social policies related to social aspects of this other type of things that are needed by the society. So especially in European Union, that we had an emphasis here over the past couple of decades on sustainability, et cetera, investments in those areas. But now they really need to prioritize and to invest more in their, as Paulo presented, in the defense industry. So for sure, this have an impact over the type of activities and how businesses are going to deal with that.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you very much, Paulo, as well.
Interesting. Thank you, Rafael, for bringing that up. It's a very interesting question. I mean, it's a very important question, of course. But I believe personally that the dollar will not go down without a fight. I don't know. Sometimes I have this sense that what backs the dollar is the United States military complex, but well, that's another question. Well, so next question. Anybody feel free to ask your question. Mm. Young asked a question in the chat box. I read it out. Thank you, Professor Paul and Professor Vanessa. May I ask your opinions on the geopolitical narrative, especially that under the tensions between some of the countries, for example, US versus China, how those M&As or may be affected? Yeah, I don't know. Who wants to pick that up?
Okay. Diversification. In the war between China and the United States, so far an economical war and technological race, you have to diversify. You have to get out. Many companies in China are leaving China and investing, for example, in Brazil, South America in general, but also Africa, Europe, India, because they already have too much investment in China. They don't want to have all the eggs in the same basket, right? So you want to get out of China. And American companies, same thing. But they already did that a little bit earlier, since the 1950s and 60s after the Second World War. For a multinational company, you have to several operations all around the planet, so that even if two countries enter in a crisis or a war, you still can be supported by the other operations. So my answer for your question is diversification. The Chinese are doing that. The Americans already did that far in the past, but also companies in Europe, India, even Brazil are doing this kind of diversification.
Yeah, I would say the same for multinational companies. They tend to optimize their international operations accordingly. So they are going to make decisions of disinvestment and new investments according to what they see that is more strategic, what can be reducing their risks. So usually these more mature multinational companies, they have the conditions of doing that. They have a robust structure and resources to do that, which can be more challenging in the case of firms that are still in the process of becoming a multinational companies, as I mentioned before. Then in that case, they can, diversification for sure is a way of trying to reduce the risks as much as they can, as Paulo mentioned.
Interesting. Thank you, Youngji, for your question. Anybody else? Oh, maybe Professor Paulo, congrats. Douglas, Paulo de Campos said, Professor Paulo, congrats, you have put India as one of the four kings. Please elaborate on timing to get there. We do understand the population size. Right now it's 1.3 billion people.
India is still growing its population from currently 1.4, some sources point 1.5 billion people. It will grow up to 1.6 or 1.7 by the 2050s, and then it will reduce the population to around 1.2 billion people by the end of the century. While that, China, which now has 1.4 billion, will be shrinking all along the century, the next 74 years, to estimated around 630 to 660 million people. So China is facing a very large problem. It will be shrinking 60% of its population over 74 years. There is no parallel on that in history. So China needs automation, needs longevity, and needs to have new sources of a consumption outside China. India has its own market still growing, and the average consumption per capita is still very low in India. So India has an internal market to use as driver, and also will go moving outward, searching for new markets. My perception is that India will do in the next 30 years what China did in the past 30 years, being the leading driver of growth in emerging markets. But India is not homogeneous. So you can have the coast of the south west coast of India is more dynamic economically than the rest of India. I'm talking about Mumbai or Bombay, Goa, Kerala, Gujarati, and so on. All the coast of south and west of India and parts of the south of India are more dynamic. If you look at the Ganges Valley, there's simply too much people there. The Ganges Valley has estimated 700 million people, half of the population of India, in the same area of the 3 states of the southern Brazil, which have, by comparison, 35 million. So imagine the 3 states of the south of Brazil with 20 times the density. This is the Ganges Valley. So India will not grow homogeneously also, but I believe that India is one of the 4 Rajs. United States will still be the hegemonic power, shrinking, becoming more complicated, in a decadence that they can revert, but still decadent. Europe running against the time because they need to reinvent themselves, and military market will be probably the way to do that. India growing, and China automatizing. China will have to go for automation because they have a shrinking and aging population. But China is still China. China will be a very strong player out of those 4 Rajas. Okay? So this is an asymmetrical game. All of them have advantages and disadvantages that are different. To play in this field, you need to understand those differences.
Interesting. Thank you, Professor Paulo. Any other question?
Yes, I would like to make a question. I'm Mauro. Professor Paulo, I want to know, as your understanding, how do you consider the level of influence of the European Union in this geo-conflict? And I do this question because I work at the textile segment, and many multinational companies in Europe, they are changing their headquarters to Asia. And that's very interesting for us to see the influence is reducing a lot. What is your opinion about that? And if Professor Vanessa can help us, if it's right, the multinational companies in Europe, they are really changing their headquarters to Asia.
The Europeans are reinventing themselves. They are looking for new alliances. But the textile market has one particularity. They need cheap labor force. So for the last 40 years or so, the answer to the question where I'm going to put my new factory had one very clear answer: China. But China is now expensive and no longer so friendly. So this answer is not ready-made anymore. The answer now is, what is your priority? And the priority may be low cost of labor, low risk in the environment, or high competence or a very sophisticated labor force. First one will lead to Southeast Asia, and that's what we're seeing. It's called friendly shore. Still an offshore, but friendly, in the idea that China is no longer so friendly. Second one, this near shore. And near shore is Latin America and Southern Europe. It was Eastern Europe, but because of the war in Ukraine, all the countries there are seen as high risk. So people in Europe basically are looking at Portugal, Italy, Spain, but also the north of Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Who is going to this near shore? Not textiles. Automakers, white lines, electronics, people that can pay a labor force that's more expensive. However, in South America, Paraguay is attracting several manufacturers of textiles because of the cheap energy and a very good tributary system, right? The taxes there are very attractive. The third one, when you need a very sophisticated labor force, is called the reshore. You go back to United States, Canada, Western Europe, and Japan. Who's going there? Optronics, ships, consulting, high-level services. You need a very sophisticated labor force. You will have to pay for that. And you need to go for that in a very safe environment and a very stable environment. So depending on the industry we are talking about, there will be a different place in the world. That means we are seeing a diaspora from China. We are not taking the manufacturers, the factories there simply. They are allowing them to depreciate, and then the new factory you do in a new place. In particular for your case, textiles, people are looking for Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, where you can find a labor force costing $1 or $2 a day. Yeah. You cannot compete with that in Europe. You cannot compete that even in the United States. Paraguay is trying to compete with that, not because of the labor force, but because of lower taxes and cheap energy. Yeah. Probably I left you with more questions than answers, but okay.
That's it. Excellent, excellent answer. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Mauro. Well, our time's up. So, and we have other questions here in line in the chat box, but unfortunately, I'm afraid we won't have time for them.
Yes.
Please, Mateus.
Thank you, Diego. Yeah, well, I saw that we have many questions left, but you're going to receive an email with the presentations and a link to the recording. And you'll be able to connect with Professor Paulo and Vanessa through email or LinkedIn to ask your questions.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your presence today. Thank you, Professor Paulo. Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Diego.
Thank you.
And you will be all included in our list for the next sessions.
Yes. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Paulo, very much.
Thank you very much for all attending. Thank you, FGC team, for the wonderful organization of the event.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.